In this video, we're going to see how to use an FTP test to individualize your cycling sessions. We're going to see how to run a good FTP test, how the results of the FTP test can enhance the quality of your endurance training, and I'll also share with you 3 mistakes that I see cyclists and other athletes do most often when they try to run this FTP test on the bike. But before that, let's see what FTP actually means and where it comes from. FTP stands for functional threshold power. More broadly, it's looking at an estimation of what's called a second physiological threshold. It's the boundary between medium and high intensity. What's the difference? Medium intensity is when the effort is sustained, it's hard in the legs, the breathing is sustained, but it's still an effort that you can hold for many minutes, even dozens of minutes at a time, whereas high intensity efforts are going to feel much harder in the legs. You're often going to be hyperventilating from a ventilatory standpoint, so breathing accelerates quite a bit. The distinction, if we talk about RPE, is usually between 7 and 8. 7 out of 10, the effort is sustained, it's hard in the legs, but you can keep it for a while. 8.5 and above out of 10, that effort becomes really hard, and now we're more into VO2 max or HIIT intensity type stuff. And this is why this FTP test can be so important, because it helps us distinguish between medium intensity and between high intensity. And there's not a better one than the other. The point is not to pit threshold versus VO2. The point is that both sessions are important. Both sessions have their place in a well thought out training plan, regardless of your level, regardless of the sport that you practice, but they're not the same sessions. They're not structured the same. The adaptations are not going to be the same either. So you should think about this when you're planning your season, when you're planning your training, and make sure you're using the right session for the right thing. And some equivalents to the FTP value are going to be things like critical power, the lactate threshold number 2, ventilatory threshold number 2, maximum lactate steady state. All those different metrics are looking to find the same thing. They're sometimes slightly different, and the way that we get to them are not the same, but they're all trying to show us the difference between medium intensity and high intensity for the reason I just stated before. Now, where does FTP come from? What is its origin? So from what I could find, the original FTP test was a 60-minute maximal effort test devised by a man called Andy Kogan, who is at the origin of the power training zones. And this hour of power, this FTP test, functional threshold power, is a good estimation of your second threshold, simply because for most well-trained cyclists, you are going to be able to hold your second threshold for about 60 minutes. And some people might debate that. I'm happy with this, but in general, we can say that for a beginner, they can hold their second threshold for about 40 minutes. High-level cyclists might be beyond 60 minutes, 70 minutes maybe even. So if we do an hour at maximal intensity, 60 minutes, we're going to be pretty close to that second threshold. And again, that's what we're trying to get to. Now, most people today know the FTP test as the 20-minute test. So let's look at where this came from. People devised that 60 minutes is hard. 60 minutes is very hard. And I totally agree with that. So the alternative would be to first do 5 minutes really hard, take a short break, and then do 20 minutes really hard, and take 95% of this 20-minute power, and you have a good estimation of your second threshold or of your 60-minute power. So why the 5 minutes of high intensity first? There is something that's called a W prime, or high intensity work capacity. Some people call that the anaerobic work capacity, anaerobic reserve. I'm not fond of the term, but I'm just kind of nitpicking on the details here. A little bit of semantics for those that enjoy those discussions. But What is that W prime? It's how much work you can do at high intensity. Once you go above that second threshold, once you go from medium to high intensity, how much work can you accumulate before you have to slow down? This is really what that W prime is looking to express. And for those who like the technical side of things, the W prime is usually expressed in kilojoules. So if you take the number of seconds spent and the delta between threshold 2 and your actual power, you can calculate those things. W prime can go from 12 kilojoules all the way up into the 30s for track sprinters and those kind of very powerful muscular profiles. And this is why we need to do those 5 minutes at high intensity before doing the 20-minute test, because then we can deplete, we can empty the tank on that W prime. You can think of it as a battery, you can think of it as a savings account. And we have to empty that savings account first before we do a 20-minute effort. Because again, if we do the 20-minute with that empty battery, that empty W prime, now we're only going to be able to ride at or just above that second threshold, but not much higher than this, because we've already spent all that work in those 5 minutes. And this would be the right way if we wanted to take 95% of our 20-minute power. This would be the right way to do it. 5-minute hard effort, all out effort for 5 minutes, short break, and then the 20-minute test, FTP test, and then we take 95% of this. Nowadays, people tend to just take 95% of their 20-minute test, disregarding completely that W prime concept, that pre-fatigue concept, that 60-minute power, which was the original FTP. And I think that's a big mistake. And I'll come back to this a little bit later in the video. So today, if you wanted to just do the 20-minute test and then take a percentage off of this, from the data that I could find, for high-level cyclists, we're going to take about 86% of their 20-minute power if we want to estimate their 60-minute power. And keep in mind that those high-level cyclists, they have very, very high endurance, they have very, very high fatigue resistance, and so it's likely that us common mortals cannot hold 86% of our 20-minute power for a full hour. So at the most, we should take 85% of our 20-minute power if we wanted to have a valid estimate of that 60-minute power and having that true FTP value that is going to express, or that is going to mark that distinction between medium and high intensity. So that would be the best way, in my opinion, to find it if we only did a 20-minute test. Now, how to run a good FTP test, in my opinion, it happens in 3 stages. Stage number 1, you want a complete warm-up before you throw yourself into a 20-minute maximal effort on the bike. What I would recommend is between 20 and 30 minutes of warm-up. It can seem a lot, but I guarantee if you're well warmed up, your test will go much better. Your performance will also be enhanced, so make sure you take the time to do that properly. The warm-up I usually recommend would be 10 to 12 minutes of low intensity riding. Then I like to do some escalating 30-30s, so we might do 30 seconds at 5 or 6 out of 10, and then we come back down to some easy riding for 30 seconds. Then we go up and we do +1, so 6 out of 10, down back to maybe 2 out of 10. 7 out of 10 for 3 seconds, back down to 2 out of 10 for 30 seconds. Up to 8, back down to 2. Up to 9, back down to 2. And then from there, we can probably do a couple 2 to 3 minute continuous intervals that are going to be aimed at the power that we would like to hold for the 20 minutes. Then you take a nice break, have some water, let the heart rate go back down, let the legs freshen up, or ride nice and easy for a few minutes, and then you'll be ready to start your 20-minute test. But definitely don't underestimate the warm-up process before that FTP test. Then the second stage is pacing your 20 minutes properly. For this, I would recommend breaking up the 20 minutes in your head into 4 different segments of 5 minutes. The first 5 minutes, you want to aim for something around 7.5 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. So it's already hard work, but you're not going all out from the start, because otherwise you're going to explode, and we don't want that. We want you to have the best score possible, and that's going to be with a progressive approach. So 7.5 out of 10 in the first 5 minutes. Then I would go to 8.5 for the following 5. Then I would go to 9.5 for the third 5-minute segment. And for the last 5-minute segment, you're going to be in a world of pain. 10 out of 10. You're just going as hard as you can, and you're trying to inch that average up and have the best result over 20 minutes. Again, there's no point starting too hard on a 20-minute test, but you have to find it just right. The first time you do it, you might feel like you still have a few percent improvement in the tank, and that's normal. The second time you do it down the line, it will be better, because you will know yourself better, you will know the test better, and you'll be able to execute it to your fullest ability. That was the second step. And the third step to conduct a good FTP test is to take the right percentage off of your 20-minute power. Again, I personally recommend 85% of your 20-minute power to find your true FTP, or your actual second threshold, or an estimate of your second threshold, which will allow you to better individualize the intensities during your biking sessions. Now, how are we going to use the result of that FTP test concretely, practically in training? The way that I would put it simply is that when you want to do a threshold session, you'd like to be under that power number that you determined as your FTP. So whether it's a sweet spot session or a threshold session, something close to that inflection between the medium and the high intensity, ideally we want to be below. Why? Simply because we're going to be able to hold it longer, and this is actually what we're trying to do when we want to push up our FTP, push up our threshold, is to be able to sustain efforts, higher intensity efforts, for long periods of time. And again, that's going to take time. So make sure when you're doing a threshold session, you're under that FTP, so you can maybe add an interval, add some minutes to each interval. I'd rather you do lower power but more time in zone 4, rather than just push the power and have to reduce the time because of it. Now, when you want to do VO2 max training, zone 5 training, high intensity training, now we're going to go above FTP. And there we're going to shorten the time. There's different intervals you can use up there. Obviously, 4-minute repeats are pretty popular. You can do hard start intervals. You can do decreasing intervals. You can do 30-30s, 30-15s, microbursts as they call them. There's many different formats of high intensity training, but one characteristic is that it is above that FTP. It's above that second threshold. And again, that's going to stimulate your VO2 max. That's going to help you increase how much oxygen your body can utilize, and also improve your high intensity performance. So that would be another good way of using that FTP value in training. And then the sessions that usually we call them threshold, I like to call them over-under threshold, and you're going to go maybe a minute above that FTP, and then you're going to come 2 minutes below that FTP, and you might repeat that 2 or 3 times. That's 6 to 9 minutes of work. Then you take a break, and then you rinse, repeat. And I think those sessions are really interesting to feel the difference between a high intensity and a medium intensity effort. And eventually, with practice, you'll be able to really feel where that transition happens. Don't get me wrong, it's not a fixed number, okay? It's not 242 watts, and at 241 you're at medium intensity, and 243 you're at high intensity. It's more of a band of a transition, but we can still feel the distinction. For me, I know that it's around 240, 250 watts. When I'm at 220, 230, I feel good. It's hard, but it feels okay. I can sustain it for a while. As soon as I go 260, boom, I really feel the legs, I really feel the breathing, and it's not the same effort for me anymore. And just knowing that distinction, yes, you have the test, yes, you have the calculation, but just knowing that in training can really help you pace efforts better, adjust your training according to how you feel each day, and maybe even improve your pacing during competitions and races, because you're going to be able to manage yourself better knowing that information. So it's good to have the test, but it's also good to practice feeling those things in training directly. Now, finally, I'm going to share with you the 3 mistakes that I see most people make when they're doing an FTP test. First mistake is to not warm up enough. I told you, you want a thorough warm up. You want to be sweating already. You shouldn't be dead by the end of your warm up, but you should be nice and warm and you should be ready for the effort. So really make sure you take enough time and you also put enough intensity in your warm up. Just doing 20 minutes of zone 2 riding before you do an FTP test is not sufficient if you want to have the best performance possible. Think of it that way. You want to open the pipes. You want to open the floodgates and make sure that that blood and that oxygen can flow as readily as possible through your body. For this, you need to stimulate your body and you need to go at or above that second threshold intensity, at least for a few minutes, so that your body can actually wake up, open up, and have all those structures ready for you when you're going to attack the test. So that's the first mistake that you need to avoid. The second one is to try and calculate your zone 2 based on your FTP. The problem with that is that zone 2 is related somewhat to FTP, okay? If we look at the first threshold or the aerobic threshold, as certain people call it, there is a correlation with the second threshold, but it's not a very strong one. And depending on your level, depending on how much you ride, depending on whether you're more endurant or more powerful, that percentage is going to change. And that percentage can even change over time for you. So it wouldn't be the best idea, in my opinion, to just take a fixed percentage of your FTP and consider that as your top of zone 2. I would rather use other ways to verify that you're in zone 2, and I made a video about this. You can go check it out right here. And then the third mistake would be to overestimate your FTP and using too high a percentage of that 20-minute power. Again, that's something that we see a lot. I know that some people right now will even say, oh, my FTP is my 20-minute power. You're just kidding yourself in the sense that you're going to overestimate your second threshold, again, by 10-15% if you do that. And this is only going to have a negative impact on your training. I'm not here to say that you shouldn't train at high intensity. High intensity is very important, but you need to understand the difference between medium and high intensity, and you need to use those tools at the right time in your training plan. And if you're aiming to do a threshold session, but you end up doing high intensity training, well, guess what? Your threshold is not going to get that much better. Yes, you're going to get better at high intensity, but usually that's why we see performance plateaus and people stop improving. It's because they think they're training one thing, but they're actually training something else, and that's not what they need at that point in time. So put your ego aside. Make sure you take that 85% at the most of your 20-minute power if you want to find your FTP, or at least the closest estimate of that 60-minute power for you. So here you go. I hope you enjoyed that new video. Know that those videos are also transformed into blogs on the UpsideStrength.com website. Go check out the blog for more information. I look forward to reading your questions about training down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.